A Legend of the Northland, a poem by Phoebe Cary. Phoebe Cary was an American poet, and she was the younger sister of poet Alice Cary. The sisters co-published poems in 1849 and then published volumes, and then Phoebe Cary went on to publish volumes of her own. After their deaths in 1871, joint anthologies of the sisters' unpublished poems were also compiled. This poem is in the style of a ballad. A ballad is a song narrating a story in short stanzas. Traditional ballads are typically of unknown authorship, having been passed on orally from one generation to the next. So this poem is a ballad. It tells a story, it can be set to music, and it is passed from one generation to the other. Away, away in the Northland, where the hours of the day are few, and the nights are so long in winter that they cannot sleep them through. The poem begins with an introduction of the place where the story is set. So the place that the story is set is somewhere in the Northland. Away, away. The repetition of away tells us that it is quite far away. So away, away in the Northland, where the hours of the day are few. So what kind of a place is Northland? It is a place where the hours of the day are few. That is, the day is quite short and the nights are so very long that in winter they cannot even sleep them through. That is, they are so long that it is difficult to sleep through the whole night time. It is dark for many, many hours, and hence people get up in the night time and continue with their work. Where they harness the swift reindeer to the sledges when it snows, and the children look like bear's cubs in their funny furry clothes. Here, the poet tells us about the lives of the people of Northland. Now, where is Northland? Northland can be it refers to the north of the world, and it could be anywhere in the north, near the North Pole. It could be any of the countries, Denmark, Norway, Finland. It could be any of those. It could be Alaska. So it is a place where there is lots of snow, where they harness the swift reindeer. That is, the poet continues with the description of the people of Northland. She says, when the snow falls, the people go about traveling and moving, go about their day-to-day work by sledging. Sledges are a particular vehicle which has it doesn't have tires. It has poles, ski-like poles, on which a reindeer can be attached, and they go about their daily work by sledging in the sledges, by attaching swift reindeers which take them across the snows. And then the dress. The children of the people of the Northland, they look like bear's cubs. They look like bear's cubs because they are dressed up in funny furry clothes. Funny furry clothes, huge big jackets which are covered with fur on the inside. This make the children look all round and roly-poly, and therefore the poet has called them funny furry clothes. Here there is use of alliteration. Funny furry clothes. Fur sound is repeated in very nearby words. Such a poetic device is called alliteration. They tell them a curious story. I don't believe 'tis true, and yet you may learn a lesson if I tell the tale to you. Once, when the good Saint Peter lived in the world below and walked about it preaching, just as he did, you know. They tell them a curious story. So the poet informs how the elders of the Northland tell their children strange and curious stories. And this particular story is quite a curious means strange story. Even the poet doesn't believe it to be a true story. And yet you may learn a lesson if I tell the tale to you. Although it may not be a true story, but she feels that she should narrate it nonetheless, as it has a good lesson, a good message for us. So, by listening to this curious, strange tale, anyone who listens to it will be able to get one of life's lessons. And then she goes on to tell us our story. Once, when good Saint Peter lived in the world below and walked about it preaching, just as he did, So she talks about a time when Saint Peter, who was a disciple of Christ, used to live in the world. That is, he was alive and he went about the world preaching to people. Preaching, talking about the words of God to people, teaching them religion. That is called preaching. So the good Saint Peter, how has he been described? Good Saint Peter. He lived in the world below. That is, he was alive. So this story is set in a long time ago. And what did he do? He walked about us. That was his work. He walked about the world, preaching the words of God to man. Walked about also means traveled. He traveled about the world, preaching the words of God to man. He came to the door of a cottage in traveling round the earth, where a little woman was making cakes and baking them on the hearth. So one day, from among his travels, one particular day, he reached the house of he reached the cottage of a little woman. In traveling around the world, that is, he was going about the world doing his business, which was preaching the word of God to man, when he stumbled across the cottage of a little woman. And this little woman, what was she doing? She was making cakes and baking them on the hearth. So this woman was making cakes, baking them on the hearth. Hearth is a fireplace. In those times, there did not used to be separate kitchens. Instead, the fireplace was a kind of it was also used as an oven where you could cook also. So she was baking her cakes on the hearth. And being faint with fasting, for the day was almost done, he asked her from her store of cakes to give him a single one. So the poet says, at this time, Saint Peter was quite faint with fasting. Faint, that is, he was feeling quite weak with fasting. Fasting, that is, he has not eaten for a long time. So he has been without food for a long time. Therefore, he was quite pale and tired and hungry. So the day was almost done, that it was almost evening, and since the day was almost done and the saint had been going around the world preaching the word of God, he felt faint with fasting. And when he came to this cottage, he saw the woman baking cakes. So he asked her from her store of cakes to give him a single one. What did he do? He asked the woman to give him a single cake. He did not ask for many. He just asked for a single one from her store of cakes. Store here doesn't mean a shop. Instead, it means that she has a collection. She has stored a number of cakes. So from the store means her collection of cakes, which she has perhaps kept on a shelf or a cupboard. So he asks her to give her from her stock of cakes. She has made a lot of cakes and they are like a stock. She has stocked them in her pantry. So he asked her to give her from her stock of cakes, just a single one. So she made a very little cake, but as it baking lay, she looked at it and thought it seemed too large to give away. Now, as the woman, what is the response to Saint Peter? Now, she has heard his request that he wants a cake, but did she give from her own store of cakes? No. What did she do? She made a new cake, a very little cake. But as it lay baking in the hearth, she looked at it and then she thought it was too large to give away. She did not even want to give away that small, very little cake that she had baked, because she felt it looked too big to be given away for free. So that is the mindset of the lady. She doesn't want to give away even the tiniest of the cakes that she has made. What did she do next? Therefore, she needed another and still a smaller one, but it looked, when she turned it over, as large as the first had done. So she started to make a smaller cake and even a further smaller one than the previous one. But even then, when she turned it over, she felt that even that smaller cake was quite big, as big as the first had done. So that smaller cake, the one that she has baked for the second time, that one also was almost as big as the first one she had baked. So she discarded the idea of giving that one also. Then she took a tiny scrap of dough and rolled it flat and baked it thin as a wafer, but she couldn't part with that. Now, what she did, she put that away also, and she took a tiny scrap of dough. Dough means the kneaded flour. So she took a very tiny scrap of dough, that is the cake mixture, and rolled it flat. She rolled it repeatedly she rolled it to show that it was very thin, and it was so thin, it was wafer-like. Wafer means very thin. So baked it as thin as a wafer, but she couldn't part with that. Even that wafer thin cake, she couldn't part with it. Couldn't be separated from, which means she couldn't even give that tiny wafer thin cake away. For she said, so what is going on in her mind now? My cakes that seem too small when I eat of them myself are yet too large to give away. So she put them on the shelf. Now this is what is going on in her mind, that these cakes that I'm baking, when I eat them myself, they appear to be too large to give away. That seem too small when I eat of them myself. That is, when she eats them herself, they appear to be very little. And when she has to give the same away, they appear too large to give it to others. So, as a result, she ended up keeping all the baked cakes on the shelf and leaving St. Peter hungry and faint as ever before. So, in order to here, it is in charity. To give away for free, that is to give in charity, seemed very difficult for her to give away even the tiniest of the cakes. Then good St. Peter grew angry, for he was hungry and faint, and surely such a woman was enough to provoke a saint. Now, all the while, St. Peter had been waiting, and she baked cake after cake, and yet she did not give it to St. Peter, and this made St. Peter very angry. St. Peter, who was now hungry and faint means weak, and surely such a woman was enough to provoke a saint. So, this is an idiom also, something which provokes a saint. To provoke a saint, meaning someone. A saint is supposed to be very, very patient. Now, because of the behavior of this woman, she succeeded in making him angry because of her inhuman, inconsiderate behavior. She did not give to St. Peter, and that her behavior, her greed, even provoked St. Peter into growing angry. And he said, "You are far too selfish to dwell in human form, to have both food and shelter and fire to keep you warm." So good St. Peter grew angry now, and in his anger, he decided to curse her. So he laid a curse on her. He said that you are far too selfish. The little woman was far too selfish. That is quite lot. Far too is a lot, too much. So that she was too selfish. Selfish means to be greedy, showing no consideration for others. So he says, since you are so selfish, you do not deserve to live, to dwell, that is to live in a human form, to have both food and shelter and fire to keep you warm. So all these blessings that God has given you, he says that you do not deserve them. Okay? So she was not deserving of the comfortable lifestyle that had been granted to human beings. That is like a house for shelter, water to keep clean and to drink, food to eat and fire to keep warm. So he says, since you are so selfish, you do not need all these comfortable things which make your life more comfortable and good. So he curses her and deprives her of all these comforts. He takes away all these comforts from the little woman, because she has proven to be quite selfish. Now, what will the woman do? How will she live? Now you shall build as birds do, and shall get your scanty food by boring and boring and boring all day in the hard, dry wood. So, Saint Peter now cursed her, deprived her all the good things in life. He said that now, like a bird, she will have to build her own nest, and in order to have food which will be obviously very scanty. Now look at the comparison. Look at her cakes. She has a store of cakes, that is a huge stock of cakes. But when she becomes a bird, what will she have? Will she be able to have a store of things? No, she will have to work hard to get at the scanty. Scanty means very little food that she will be getting. For that, she will have to work really hard by boring and boring into the wood. Boring means drilling, making a hole into the wood all day in the hard, dry wood. And it will be very difficult because she will have to dig holes into the hard wood in order to get the worms or the insects to feed herself. So that will be her life from now on, because she has been very, very selfish and uncharitable. Now you shall build as birds do, and shall get your scanty food by boring, boring, boring all day in the hard, dry wood. Then up she went through the chimney, never speaking a word, and out of the top flew a woodpecker, for she was changed to a bird. Then what happened? Soon after being cursed, the woman could be seen going up the chimney of her house. She was never speaking a word, that is, her throat, she became speechless. She couldn't speak a word of protest or anything, and out of the top flew a woodpecker. So the woman couldn't say a word when she was cursed, and instead of the woman, she went up through the chimney, and who came out from the top? It was a woodpecker, for she was changed to a bird. So a woodpecker could be seen flying out of her chimney. She had a scarlet cap on her head that was left the same, but all the rest of her clothes were burned black as a coal in the flame. Now, this woodpecker which flew out of the chimney had once been the lady. Now she had a scarlet cap on her head. She here refers to the little lady. When she was in the house, she had a scarlet means red cap on her head, and that was left the same. So when the woodpecker flew out, people could see that it had a red cap on its head. So it's an explanation how the woodpecker has a red top of head. So that is because of the scarlet cap of the woman. It was left the same. But all the rest of her clothes were burnt as black as coal in the flame. So as she went through the chimney, her head was left untouched, but the rest of her clothes were burnt to ashes. And that is why it has now become as black as coal, whereas the bird's head was still the same shade of red. And every country schoolboy has seen her in the wood, where she lives in the trees till this very day, boring and boring for food. The poet says that every country schoolboy has seen the woodpecker in the woods. The woodpecker can be seen pecking into the bark of the trees, searching for food to eat. So this is a lesson for all little children and others also, that if a person is uncharitable, if they do not give away happily in charity, they will suffer the consequences of their actions. So if you give in charity, God will bless you. If you do not, you may have to suffer because of your uncharitable behavior. That is the lesson that we learn from this poem. Here you can see that the poet wants to tell us how by not giving in charity, the woman had suffered. This poem has a dramatic narrative. That is, it tells a story. It tells a plot. So here the poet is narrating to the readers of a poem the legend that has been passed on to her by her elders from the far, cold Northland. She is not putting across her own thoughts or feelings or of whether she accepts this legend or not. It is just a moral story which is narrated for the common good. The lesson that we learn here is that greed is a quality which God does not like. If a person is greedy and uncharitable, God does not like that person, and because of that, instead of getting rewards, such people get punished sometime or the other in their life. That is now there is a question here which says, do you think the old lady would have been so ungenerous if she had known who Saint Peter really was? What would she have done then? The old lady, if she would have known that it was Saint Peter, she was being a selfish woman, she would have given her best cake to Saint Peter because she would have expected something good in return. She would have expected Saint Peter's blessings in return. Because of being greedy, she would have done this. She would have given her best cake or a lot of cake so that she could get something good in return. So that is the end of the poem, and we can just have a quick look at the poetic devices. Okay, so first we have discussed that it is we have away, repetition. Then there is an allusion, that is a literary reference to a historical or literary person or event, that is Saint Peter. Saint Peter was one of the disciples of Christ. Then in the second paragraph, the children look like bear's cubs. So like bear's cubs, it is simile where a comparison using like or as is made. Here the children look like bear's cub is one simile, and in the second last paragraph, black as a coal, here it is also simile. Black, that is the woodpecker's color is black, it is compared to so black like coal, as a coal, black as a coal in the flame. So that is another simile. Then boring and boring and boring. At two places you have, it is again a use of repetition. Boring and boring and boring. It is drilling holes in the tree. Then there is the use of enjambment also. What is enjambment? Enjambment is the continuation of a sentence without a pause beyond the end of a line or couplet or stanza. So here you can see how one line runs into the other. For example, and he said, you are far too selfish to dwell in a human form. Far too selfish. After that there is a break in the line. It goes on to dwell in a human form. So when a sentence is continued without a pause at the end of a line, that is called enjambment. enjambment, enjambment. All right. That is all with the poem. Thank you, children.